Hello, and welcome to the Culture Connection Speaker Series. I'm Michael Beckelheimer in Washington, D.C., and I'm talking with American professors of Russian studies about their insights into Russian culture and how they teach it in American colleges and universities. So this program is presented by the American Center of Moscow, which is supported by the American Embassy in Moscow. If you're watching on the American Center's YouTube, VK, or Telegram channels, please post your comments and questions at any time. I'll see them and I'll answer them as we go along. For Russian subtitles, you can select closed captioning in Russian. So, hi, Laura. Today we're talking to Laura Osterman, a professor in the Russian program at the University of Colorado Boulder, where she teaches courses on Slavic folk culture, Russian fairy tales, women in Russian culture, the absurd and supernatural in Russian culture. So a lot of great areas to explore in Russian culture. She also sings Russian and Bulgarian folk songs with the music group Planina, Songs of Eastern Europe. Laura, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here.
Great. A great first question for us to get us going is how did you become interested in Russian, and when was the first time you went to Russia?
I became interested when I was a child, and I saw the Moscow Circus. And I also met a Russian man. I don't know if I met him, but I saw him from a distance, and he was talking to his dog in Russian. And it just stuck with me. And then I learned Russian in high school. In those days, they did have Russian in my high school. And then I went to Russia the first time in 1982 and I happened to be there when Brezhnev died. I was on a program with SUNY Albany, the State University of New York at Albany. We were there for a whole semester in Moscow.
Quick question: Where did you see the circus?
Probably in New York City, because I grew up near New York City. Yeah, okay. At Madison Square Garden.
Okay, so typical Russian question at that time: did you see the old circus or the new circus?
I have no idea.
I never knew the difference, actually. All my Russian friends would ask, but it was a great circus, whatever it was.
It was.
So you were there when Brezhnev died. What were your impressions? What was the mood like?
Oh, well, my friends in the dormitory were very cynical about Brezhnev, and they told jokes about him. So I was collecting a lot of folklore, even though I wasn't yet. I didn't even know what folklore was, but I knew what jokes were, and I loved them. So I was writing down Brezhnev jokes and just really enjoying everything about it. But of course, it became very serious when he died. We couldn't go out into the street. Well, we could go into the street, but we couldn't take the subway. We were curtailed. Our movements were curtailed for a couple of days, I think. We couldn't go to the Institute. Yeah, it was made a big impression on me.
Because you were right in the center of town, right?
We were right in the center, yeah, right near Red Square.
And were your fellow classmates, were they Russian or foreign or?
Oh, our classmates were all Americans in our classes, but in the dormitory, there were Russian men. In those days, they didn't have women living in dorms as much because I guess the women's families thought it was best if they stayed at home. But there were men from all over Russia on the floor below me. So I went down to hang out with them. And that was the only Russians that I met at first. It was just the people living in the dorms.
Did the Zhornaya on your floor have a problem with you going down to the other floors?
No, not at all. Nobody was watching. Nobody cared what we did, although they said there was people watching us, watching our movements, but nobody bothered us. It was okay.
One of the topics that we're going to talk a lot about today is your work, your research on women in Russia, women in the Soviet Union. And you have mentioned that most of the people around you were Russian men while you were studying for the first time. Were you at that time already looking at women in Russia and the relations between women and men and power structures. And what were your observations then?
Yeah, I was. I was very interested in what I observed, which was that all my teachers were women at this institute of, it was the Institute of Foreign Languages imeni Marisa Tariaza. So um, that was the name of it. And yeah, the teachers were all women. They were all very well dressed. They were extremely professional, very well educated women. And eventually, and I got interested in, what they read and like, were there any female writers that they read? And they told me about Natalia Baranskaya's Week Like Any Other, Nedelia Kak Nedelia. And I went home and read that, and then I wrote my senior thesis on that work and other works by Russian women writers. So that was a discovery for me.
So you were inspired by the women who were
Yes,
teaching you, but you were drinking vodka and learning, jokes and
exactly.
anecdotes from the guys on the other floors in the dorm. What were your observations about male-female relations?
I mean, I don't think I had a very well-formed observations at that point. But I did know that when I went into a drinking establishment, it was all men, all
Hmm.
100% men. I was the only woman there, but nobody, and it didn't bother anybody that I was there. It was okay. Um, and yeah, I did notice that, if you go into like a store or something, it was mostly women doing the shopping, that kind of thing. So
Hmm.
yeah, pretty traditional
Yeah,
gender um, division there.
yeah. And
Yeah.
you were there for a few months,
And we were there for 4 months. Yeah. In the
and
fall of 84, 82, sorry.
Um, so you're not only a scholar and a professor, but you also grew up in a family of folk singers, and you
Hmm.
yourself are a folk singer. And a lot of your scholarly work is on folk tradition. So today
Yes.
we're going to be talking about women in the Soviet Union, folk tradition, women in rural villages. So all of that sort of mixes together very nicely and makes for, I hope, is a very interesting conversation. Um, let's talk about the music. When did you first start singing Russian folk music?
I think the first brush I had with Russian folk music was when I was at a student at Indiana University, and they happened to sing Stravinsky's Les Noces, the wedding.
The wedding.
And that is very striking music. And the texts are like, I'm like, this is Russian? Because I had already been learning Russian. It just didn't seem like Russian. So, and then I transferred after my master's, I transferred to Yale University for my PhD. And at Yale, they have a Slavic chorus run by students. It's called the Yale Slavic Chorus. It's women only, and it still exists. And it was founded in 1969 when they first admitted women to Yale. And they sang a mix of Bulgarian, Russian, Polish music. And I auditioned when I first arrived to Yale, and it became my like home. Like I just really, really took to it and really had so much curiosity about this music, and um, ended up doing a lot more with it. In fact, I thought about writing my dissertation on folk music, but my advisors were like, that, just do literature. And they were right. Literature is probably the better choice. So I did. I wrote my dissertation on Tolstoy's War and Peace, but I kept that as my second interest, folklore, and I ended up switching over pretty much to doing all my scholarship on folk culture, kind of folklore, folk, kind of everyday culture. I would even describe it as, yeah.
But you think that was, but you're glad that you stuck with Tolstoy and literature for the actual dissertation.
It made it easier to prove that I had the chops to be a
Hmm.
professor, I think.
Right,
Yeah, and to
right.
get a job in 19, whenever I got my first job was like 1992, I think. Yeah.
Where did you go for your first job?
My first job was New College, University of South Florida. And then that was only for 2 years. And then I had another 1 year job. And then I got this job at University of Colorado Boulder. And I've been here since 96,
Right.
1996.
So at those years, Russian studies were, I mean, it was sort of, that was heading into a bit of a crisis, because there would be a period in the 90s when students weren't studying Russian, and, maybe, so, Russian-American relations weren't top of mind. Was that a problem for you, getting students interested in Russian literature and folklore?
No, we didn't see that at all. We had a lot of students in our courses. When I first was hired, I was teaching a course on Intro to Russian Culture with 60 people. So yeah, now we can't get 60 people to
Right.
sign up for an Intro to Russian Culture. We have that only in very special courses, like our sports course. It attracts that many people.
I'm going to ask to start the slideshow because we do have some images. Oh, that was fast. Hold on, I'm sorry. There we go.
Yeah. Start at the beginning.
Sorry, yeah. It's not unlike me to go backwards. So I think you already answered one of my questions. You were in the Yale Slavic Chorus.
Mm-hmm.
Started when women were admitted in 1969. There was also the Yale Russian Choir, right?
Yes.
Is that all men?
All men. Oh, nowadays, though, everything is different because they go by voice. So women do sing now in the tenor range in the Yale Russian chorus, but I don't think they have any men yet in the Yale Slavic chorus, which is the traditionally women's chorus.
So tell us about what your group was singing and what it was like singing Slavic folk music in Connecticut at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it was just wild, to be singing a range. A lot of it is arranged music that was brought over by American, I don't know, I guess they're scholars, yeah, like Ethel Rehm and Martin Koenig in the 1960s, 1970s, and they created albums, collections of Slavic folk music, mostly from Bulgaria, former Yugoslavia, and a little bit from Russia. And so we would learn them off of the records. And then what you're showing here is an offshoot of that. So two of the former members of the group graduated. Elizabeth and Vlasta graduated, and they thought it would be fun right after they graduated to go on an adventure for a whole year to find out what people in Eastern Europe really sing. Like, not this arranged stuff, but like, what do they sing when they're washing the dishes or at the table after a meal, a celebratory meal. And so together we hatched a plan to go over to Eastern Europe, and we chose 3 locations to divide up a year of travel. The first, we went to Bosnia for 4 months, and we're traveling around in various locations in Bosnia. Then we went to Bulgaria. Similarly, we chose an area to focus on, the Rhodop Mountains, and then we went to Moscow, to the Soviet Union, for 2 months at the end. So 4 months, 4 months, 2 months. And then we couldn't really travel to villages because it was illegal. We were like, oh, do we want to break the law? And we were like, no, probably not. I mean, there was one ethnomusicologist that we met who was willing to take us out to a village that she worked in. And we were just like, oh no, we'll just stay within the area that we were allowed to be in, which was basically cities.
Right.
And
So
And
this was
so
the late 80s, right? This was like
late,
88,
yeah, this was
89.
by then it was 1990. So that the year was 1989, 90 that we
Okay.
traveled.
Okay.
And in 1990, we went, we basically met a bunch of ethnomusicologists and talked to them about their work and listened to all these albums that they had created. And we collected a lot of material that way, actually, probably more than we would have had we just gone to a village. Um, and a wide variety of materials. So it was good. It was a good like first you know acquaintance with Russian folk singing.
I imagine this was the perfect time for a group of Americans to be in the Soviet Union, sort of, exchanging and, interacting and talking about culture, and collaborating. Um, what was,
People were welcoming, yes,
yeah,
in that sense. It was difficult because there was nothing in the stores to buy to eat, so we ended up having to go to restaurants a lot because you couldn't. There would be like nothing in the stores, and if you wanted to get eggs or something, you had to wait in long lines.
right. Did you sing while you were there at that time?
We
Did you
did, we
perform with other
sang
groups?
everywhere because people were like, "What? Americans Americans are coming to us that sing Slavic music." And so we had a little repertoire of like 4 or 5 songs that we sang everywhere when asked to sing.
Was there any, at that point, did you notice that there was, what was the attitude towards Slavic and Russian folk music at the end of the 80s? I mean, it was such a turbulent time. Were people were Russians more receptive to those Slavic and folk music roots that they had, or was that
Absolutely.
still
Yeah, and we were socializing with scholars only. So scholars are always curious, I
okay?
think, no matter what when you talk with them, but they were super curious. Yeah. So some of the music that we sang, they had maybe already heard, but they hadn't, and so that was nice for them. And then they were trying to show us similar traditions in within the bounds of Russia, the Russian Federation, for example. Um, they showed us that the drone that is characteristic of South Slavic music is also used in West Russian music in Bryansk, for example. So we got very interested in the Bryansk traditions with the little bit of a drone there in Russian, burdon.
I was going to ask if what because you traveled around that region and you sang music from that region and you've from all of Slavic areas. What is unique about, or what have you found to be unique about Russian folk music?
Yeah. So what is really cool about Russian folk music is the polyphony, which they have it in South Slavic traditions, but it's not as developed. It is usually two voiced only, and only in certain regions. The other regions are all unison traditions, unison singing if they sing in groups or solo. But in Russia, they have this highly developed polyphony, which I didn't, even at the time, I don't think I was appreciating or realizing how developed it was. It was only later when I did my research for the Performing Russia book, and I worked more in depth with these revivalists, which were the same people essentially that I met in 1989, 90. That I realized that this polyphony is a whole world. It is just, you could spend your whole life learning how to sing it. It is musically very complex, and so it is more comparable, like to Georgian tradition than it is to the South Slavic traditions. It's just very, very different animals.
After this experience, did you go back to Yale and back to your Slavic chorus and say, "Look, folks, I've been to Russia. I've done my research. We need to do things differently here in our
I
choir."
didn't end up doing that until later. when I joined the chorus in here in Boulder and Denver, we we were able to really replicate some of that polyphony, because we had some men join the group, and um, it's nice when you can have some male voices as well as the female voices, because
Mhm.
if you try to do it all with women's voices, the ambitus, you know, the sort of pitches that you need to cover are pretty broad, and so it's hard to find enough singers to do both the high voices and the low voices. Um, and yet it's super challenging for American singers. They have to really devote themselves to it, and they find the text difficult. Russian texts are more difficult than Bulgarian texts because of the softness, the palatalization. Um, and the polyphony is hard to get used to. That the improvisatory quality of the three different um, voices that are independent of one another.
And so you're singing in a group in Boulder now,
Hmm.
right?
Yes,
And that's not associated with the school. That's just
right.
tell us
It's a
about that
community
group.
group. In fact, we rehearse at a church without having any religious affiliation. We just need a space,
Hmm.
and we happen to know one of our members knew this church, so we have an arrangement with a church, and we get paid for our performances, and we use that money to pay our director a little bit, and we pay for our costumes when we travel. We sometimes raise money to travel to supplement the travel. We can't pay for all of it. For example, we went to Georgia last year to learn Georgian polyphony, and so we're singing a lot more Georgian songs now.
Right. Wow. That's wonderful. Do you ever recruit your students to come and sing in your
I
choir?
do, yes. I'm quite a recruiter. I'm always bringing in new people, and as much as I can. Um, but it is hard for students. You know, they're busy and they don't always stick around. But yes, there have been a number of students who've come through.
So your experience singing folk music and studying folk music and sort of really embedding yourself in a lot of these folk traditions in Russia has, I think, well, I know, given you an interesting insight into Russian folk tradition, Russian rural life. It seems like sort of a nice bridge to your research on rural life in Russia. And this is interesting. Usually we're talking about the big cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg. Um, and I know in my experience in Russia, people always ask, why aren't you in the provinces? Why aren't you
Oh,
out in the
yeah.
villages? And, so I think that's fantastic that you actually have had a lot of experience out in the villages. So I have a couple questions about that, and then we have some pictures to show. Um, what can you tell us about your experience learning about the Russian folk tradition? And because the theme of this, the loose theme of this speaker series is how culture was preserved from the Russian period into the Soviet period, and perhaps how the culture was used by the Soviets. If you have any thoughts on the role of Russian folk tradition in the early Soviet cultural formation, I would love to hear that.
Yeah. So there's a good amount of continuity. You know, tradition is tradition, it's going to stay. What we noticed is that with the Soviet period commencing, first of all, the economic, of course, basis of village life changed. And, you know, this came from research and really also from my collaboration with Svetlana Adonyeva, because some of these ideas were hers, and then we worked on them together to present them in our book called Worlds of Russian Village Women. But what we noticed is that the traditions that are practiced within the home, they did remain the same, a lot of them. A lot of the beliefs, especially the belief in the continuity of the family, the importance of the ancestors, those things remained I don't know, untouched is probably the wrong word, but they remained very strong. And the women, these are elder women in the village, and elder women, they had a lot of power before. They still have a lot of power, perhaps even more with the Soviet period. The Soviet period kind of broke down the male family hierarchy by dekulakizing the village. But the female hierarchy remained, with some changes, with a lot more equalization of the hierarchy, but still the elder women preserve certain powers and certain knowledges that they need to bequeath, and they want to bequeath when the younger women are ready.
Mm-hmm.
This is what you're showing here is a group of elder women from a village that Professor Natalia Gilyarova from Moscow State Conservatory brought me to in 1995. And there I first heard stories about the supernatural from elder women. The women were telling stories about how there were certain rivalries among them. And one of them believed that another was a witch and that she had made her have a hoarse voice when Professor Gilyarova came to record them. So she told how, she'd been touched on the shoulder by this other woman that made her have a hoarse voice so she couldn't record. She was telling Professor Gilyarova that, and they wrote it down as a supernatural story, Belichka. And I didn't understand that story at all when I first heard it. I heard it, and I didn't even know it was a supernatural story. But I saw they had written it down in the notebook. And they, beating the students that were with Professor Gilyarova. And I saw the summary of it there in literary Russian. And so there I could understand it. And that opened my eyes to the spiritual world that these women have, not just the music, but their belief in spirits, and both harmful and helpful. They're not separate, but like the spirits can do both. And so that got me really into that. That led to my second book, that I wrote with Svetlana, which I'll tell you more about. But anyway, yeah, what you're seeing here is this interaction between city people and village people. And then we brought a group of Americans in 1996. That's what you're seeing here. On the right-hand side are the Americans. On the left are the Russians from, I think this might have been Lasina in Ryazanskaya Oblast.
What do you mean Americans?
Oh, these were Americans who were interested in folk music, and I had advertised it as you could learn about the Russian folk wedding, like the traditional wedding, and learn some wedding songs. And Professor Gilyarova helped design it, and she led it, gave lectures, and then we went out to these villages all together. So these were Americans who were interested in either folk tradition or folk singing. Most of them, I think, were singers.
When you talk about villages, define village. What is a village? What is a Russian village?
Well, Russians all know what a village is, but Americans do not, because we don't have villages. It's just something that is magical. It's just a very small like town. I don't know how to describe it. And usually it's centered around maybe a church, or centered around a street. And the street goes right through it, and the houses are along the street. There are village houses that do not typically have plumbing nowadays. Even they typically get their water from a well, and they have an outhouse, and all these things are something that we don't see very often in America. We would have to go maybe to the mountains of Appalachia to see such a thing. There are mountain villages here in Colorado. Actually, I have found villages here, and I've showed them to Russians, and they agreed that this is a village, but nowhere else in America did they see a village.
When you were doing your research and when you were traveling around and presumably selecting villages to visit, to meet people, how do you find the ones that have the most active folk traditions?
Well, you go with Professor Gilyarova. You go with a professor, because if you don't, it's hard to find. And so it is a different trip when you go with a professor like Professor Gilyarova, because she really is keyed into that. She is looking for the ones that have preserved their old singing traditions. Whereas when I was advised by Professor Adonyeva of St. Petersburg University, that was a whole different experience. We just chose a village that was based on where one of her students had family. And in fact, the family did not live in the village. They lived in the Rayonny Center, the village center, the regional center of Syamzha in Vologda Oblast. And so from there, we went out to villages.
To villages.
Yes. Right. And in that case, the uncle, he called. He was the head of the MCS, like the emergency services in Syamzha, and he called all the villages. He knew who to call, and he said, "Get ready, Americans are coming to visit you." And so we had tour guides in every village. It's hard to do it without that. You kind of need connections, right?
For sure. Yeah. And so we have a couple pictures here of you still with Professor Gilyarova.
Yes.
In the conservatory.
Mm-hmm. There she is interviewing a singer in Yermolova. And you can see people always put out food for us.
Yeah.
No such thing as just Americans come and there's no food on the table. There has to be food and vodka.
Right. Well, if you put food and vodka out, they'll stay too long.
They'll stay longer.
And here
we are, that whole group of us. The Americans, I think, are on the right and the bottom. There's me on the bottom in navy blue with short hair.
What were their impressions?
The Americans or the Russians?
Yeah, the Americans.
The Americans, I think they had a really good time. There were some difficulties. I think I remember somebody getting bothered by somebody and needing to move to a different house. When we stayed in the village, move to a different house or, things like that. But everybody had a good time, and the music did end up making its way into some arrangements that, for example, one member of Kitka, an American singing group, went on this trip and used the material later on.
Great. That's cool. And then one other photo.
Yeah, the Yermolova singers, they were so vibrant, so energetic. You can see they're pretty old. These are pensioners, but they just really enjoyed their music. Very lively people.
Did they travel out of their village to perform, or did they?
They do, yeah, they did. In those days, they all talked about trips that they had done, and they didn't travel long. Maybe for a few hours for a performance, and they would get presents for performing. So yeah, they were encouraged by the local establishment, the local government. Yeah.
And then, so then in 2004, if I understand your biography,
yeah,
you began researching with the professor in Petersburg on rural village women.
On gender at this point. Yeah. So I came to Svetlana Adonyeva with the topic that I was interested in, which was to look at specifically the folklore of Russian women. And later she joined the project. But at the time, she just set me up with her students to go out to villages in Vologda Oblast. And that was a great idea because it was really different to go out with somebody that had already connections and knew the local culture, like her student did.
Who
And
was she? Who was Svetlana Adyanova?
no, Svetlana Adoneva is still in St. Petersburg. She has retired from her post as a professor of literature at St. Petersburg State University. But she's still active as a scholar, and I still work with her. I'm writing another book with her, this time on the discourse and practices of the women's reproductive bodies in Russian villages also.
So this first book, you followed 3 generations of Russian
Yes.
women. Were they related within a family, or were just different women of different differentiation?
Yeah, they were. We just did, had interviews. She had decades of interviews. Starting in 1983, St. Petersburg State University had been keeping their interviews in an archive, and all of that was digitized. They had put it into a file, into files, a folder, and so we used that material, and we just divided the material or the reports that came from women of different generations. So that's what we mean by different generations, but not related to one another.
Got it.
Yeah.
What was your hypothesis when you embarked on this project? What did you think you were going to find? What were you looking for?
Well, I already knew about the singing, and I was interested in writing more about the singing. And Svetlana acquainted me with the idea of generations, the idea of differences in the generations. And she was very interested in these power relations between the generations, between women of different generations. There we are talking about women in a single family.
Mm-hmm.
And how they interacted. And so that was all her contribution to that piece, which really became kind of essential for the whole book. We were really focusing on these women of the older generation who have the most power because they have worked up their way up and they have the most knowledge as well. They can usually do spells, they can sing, they can tell сказки to their grandchildren. And they may speak in posloviцы, and they just are fountains of knowledge. So we spent a long time with these women, often, as you show here in this picture, sitting over, poring over their photo albums
Mm-hmm.
and looking at, their lives. And so they would tell really interesting stories just in the context of, sitting and having tea. And those were valuable.
So this older generation of women in the villages who can cast spells and have this this wealth of knowledge and experience, how do they view themselves? Do they view themselves as typical older village women, or special because they have this appreciation for and abilities, special abilities as an older woman in the village? What do they think they are?
They're strong women. So they're in charge. So when you come and stay with them, they tell you what to do. My experience was being told who to talk to, who not to talk to, who was a witch, who wasn't a witch, maybe not every woman is like this, for sure, but definitely they have advice to give. And we were younger women at that time. Now I'm 62, so I'm of that generation now. And so if I went, I would be more equal to them. But at the time, I was a younger woman, and so they gave me all kinds of advice about my boyfriend. I didn't have children yet, so future children and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, just they know everything.
Right. Well, except for the witch part, that sounds like every babushka I ever encountered.
Exactly. Yeah.
They know and they tell you what to do. How widespread and how deep did this supernatural belief go?
Well, usually, to kind of do a devil's advocate approach here, um, if we ask people, directly if they believed in spirits or something, they'd usually say, of course not. But then we would say, oh, what do you do if you lose a cow? And they would say, oh, well, you have to do these special practices, or you have to throw this piece of paper into the woods, or what, or you have to go see this person who can get a cow back. And we'd be, oh, tell me more about how you get a cow, so you really, you can't ask directly because everybody will deny it. But it's very deep. These are practices that um, uh, these have gone all the way down to younger generations of Russians, especially people from the village, or whose families are based in the village. They will understand the world in a specific way, that everything is connected, that um, we are connected to the dead of our family, that they come, those of our family come back to us in certain ways, in dreams or in more than just memories. And so I think it's very, very deep and widespread.
So, is there a distinction between the younger generation of women who hold fast to these beliefs and these traditions and may or may not consider themselves able to cast a spell, and the other, and then the ones who want to just move to Moscow or St. Petersburg?
Yeah. Yeah, there must be a distinction, I think. But even if you meet people who move to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and and you say, I don't know, you just scratch the surface, they'll start telling you about somebody that they're keeping away from because they have powers, or they have negative powers, right? The negative energy. They might call it something differently, but
Hmm.
um, these beliefs, I think, don't go away, even if people move away from the village.
Right. Um, yeah, I mean, you can't avoid the superstition and all of the requirements for what to do and when to do it based on those beliefs.
Yeah.
Um, so we have a couple more pictures here. Um,
Yeah, so this the man in the center here is Luba Golubova's grandfather. Luba was the one that uh, led us to this area, and he was an interesting man. He um, taught us about the men's perspective, which was valuable because there weren't that many, you know, chances to speak to a man about what it was like to be a young man, and um, he was he was popular, I think. He was a singer and um, enjoyed his younger days. So these people all sang Chastushki for us, which we collected.
and what are chestushki?
Oh, Chastushki are usually 4-line little songs that were improvised. So you could easily create new Chastushki for a specific purpose or a specific thought that you had that you wanted to express. They actually, the genre came out of lyric song, we think. So they, by taking like 2 lines out of a lyric song and then adding another 2 lines, you could create a Chastushka. And it was a very productive genre in the late 19th, early 20th century, all the way up to, this was in 2004. We were collecting these Chastushki. And when I was more recently um, in sorry, my brain is just cut out. But I was in Russia in 2020, and I also heard Chastushki from elder women. So it's still a viable and productive genre that people really enjoy. And you don't have to have music going on. You can just recite them like little poems, like little limericks. They're funny.
But then you create them on the fly. I mean, they must always be evolving and based on the what's happening around you.
They evolve. I wouldn't say people create them on the fly. I think they think of them ahead of time
Okay.
because it's hard to think that fast. It's go, you know, you're reciting them pretty darn fast. So yeah, I think they might think of it. You know, I want to get back at my rival, or I want to, you know, zinger for today's Chastushki competition. So people will think of a new one like that. And here I am with Lyuba Golubova's uncle, the in Siamja in 2004. And they taught me how to drink after a banya. That was what was being shown there. And this is a group in a Ryazan village. So I had gone back to the same village that Professor Gilyarova had brought me to a decade earlier. And they still remembered me. And this was in winter of 2004. Stayed with one of the singers, and then I went from house to house and just, you know, interviewed people. And then we did these impromptu singing sessions. You can see my recording equipment there on the table, and the tea, the bread, and the jam in an evening in winter. So it was interesting to go to a village in winter. It was very empty, very different than in the summer. Where in the summer there's grandkids around and lots going on, people out in the street. In winter, not so much. It was very quiet, very peaceful, but you could find women at home in their homes.
Mm-hmm.
And they had lots of time to talk to you.
That looks so cozy. I mean, surrounded by snow. Is it because a lot of the places in those villages are dachas and people just aren't out there in the winter?
That in Ryazan, yes, maybe you could say that because there are dachniki there. But these are women who are from the village and born there and raised there. So yes, that's probably right. And then so they sometimes move to a city during the winter because their kids think it's hard for grandma to stay in the village.
Right.
So we're going to bring her to the city. Yeah.
So I'd like to switch to your research and your work on Soviet female authors. If you could talk about how you became interested in women who were writing in the Soviet period, and then I have a few specific questions about Natalia Baranskaya. But how did this come about?
Yeah, well, I remember sitting down with Novy Mir, the journal, in the library, just leafing through and seeing how many women had written. And there just weren't many women writers. So that got me interested in women writers. And Natalia Baranskaya was one of them. But then I became interested in just, how many women writers were there even in the 19th century. Nowadays, there's a lot more scholarship on 19th century women writers. I was just at a big conference on our field on Russian literature and culture, Russian, East European, and Eurasian. And I listened to a panel on Russian women writers of the 19th century. And there's, scholars doing a lot of research on that and uncovering new authors, in fact, as we speak. So it's still a really burgeoning, new field, which is great. And these are not bad authors either. The reason they're not remembered is because, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Pushkin dominate the scholarship, but there's no reason not to read the women as well.
Right. Is this like finding undiscovered books of the Bible?
Yes, exactly. And I think women writers give us an additional perspective that male writers might have. They might have a different perspective. It's nothing to say either is bad or good, but women writers are going to give more of a detailed perspective, perhaps, on what it's like, maybe the emotions, the day-to-day concerns of women. So I think we find that in these authors, and I find it inspiring. I think my students do as well.
You know, I asked one of my close Russian friends if she had she's about your age, and I asked her had she ever read Natalia Baranskaya, because we talk a lot about what we're reading, and she said no, but I should.
Yeah.
And so I want to follow up with that. But so I picked up A Week Like Any Other, her short novella. It was fascinating. I was not expecting it to be so honest and clear and detailed about her life. And I also know that it was, it was written in the 60s, right? And it was
Mhm.
published in the United States in a couple different magazines.
Yep.
And I was going to ask you before I read the book, I was going to ask you why, but now that I've read it, it it doesn't feel that different from what an American woman would be
I
saying at
think
the
that's
same
right.
time.
Yeah. The only
So,
difference would be the way that, the shopping goes.
oh
In
yeah,
America in the 60s, they did have supermarkets, and in Moscow, I think the action is set in Moscow. She lives in the edges of Moscow. The transportation is not up to snuff, right? So she's late for work.
right.
And also when she goes to shop, she has to stay in all those different lines, which must have been very difficult. It's hard enough to
Right.
do day-to-day life when you do have a supermarket, but when have those other impediments, it makes it harder.
Was it because in the 1960s, in this period of the thaw, is that what made it possible for her to write about all of the problems that were impeding her ability to do all of the things she had to do in the course of a day?
That could be, although this was already, into Brezhnev's reign.
Yeah,
So that,
it was late 60s. Yeah.
yeah, it was late 60s. I think she's mildly critical, and well, I don't know. She's critical enough. I think you're right. Novimir was able to publish stuff like that in that period, right? We have Matryonin Dvor published around the same time, Solzhenitsyn's work. So I think that it was still open, like you're saying. Um, what we notice as looking back and reading it from our perspective is that there's no solution given. It's a lot of problems and a lot of explanation of difficulties that the woman encounters at that time, but no hope. It's just circular. The novella ends where it begins, right, with the alarm clock ringing, and it's another week and she's going to go through the same thing again. So a little bleak.
A little bleak.
Yeah.
Have you found that most Russian women or many Russian readers are familiar with Natalia Baranskaya?
I think, well, when I asked about it, they were. I don't know about now. I haven't gone and asked women nowadays if they have read Baranskaya's novella. I'm guessing it's been forgotten, but I recommend it.
Yeah. Well, you use it in your course. Can you tell us about the one of the course you're teaching now about
Yes, I'm
women in 20th?
yes, I'm teaching women in 20th and 21st century Russian, East European, and Eurasian culture, and it is a review of culture from. Actually, we begin with the women question from the 1870s, when the question of where women belong, where do they belong outside the home in work environments, or should they just be educating their children? That question was raised in the Russian magazines, thick magazines, and it's still an actual question. Where should women be, and what should they be doing with their time and their energy? How much should we be educating women? How much should women be educating themselves, and for what purpose? And so I think that question sheds light for the whole semester, and how we can keep revisiting it. Like, how do different works of cultural works view that question? You know, we see it in, especially in the 1960s with like Baranskaya's work. We see it in the movie Wings. We watched that one as well, from Larisa Shepitko's work. And we're ending up with Pussy Riot as the end point of the semester.
Do your students, are they familiar with Soviet history and life in the Soviet Union? Like, are they able to put that this author's experience in that context? Natalia
No,
Roscoe?
they are not. So I give them a little bit of, a timeline and a kind of, here's what's going on at the time. And I think those students who don't have that background find it challenging, because it's a complex history, and to learn the history and as well as the culture is very difficult.
I mean, my impression reading it was it felt like this is for women, their work and career life was a bit advanced because they were very
Yeah.
involved in this highly technical work.
Yes, they were making plastics at that time, polymers. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, I think that is true. I think we still see that. Women are still in the workforce. And I don't know if it's just the same level as it was during the Soviet Union. That's an interesting question about statistically. But I think work is still very important. Work outside the home, I like to say that, is still very important to
Right.
women.
But she originally, we have a couple minutes left. She originally was working at the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, not the art museum, but the literary museum.
Yeah.
Why did she start writing so late? What's her story?
Yeah, well, I don't think she viewed herself as a writer earlier. She was a museum worker, yeah, like the Pushkin Museum. Then she was a single mother. Her second husband was killed in 1943 in the war. And it was really in her retirement that she began to write. And she wrote A Week Like Any Other in 1960. Sorry, at age 60,
At age
1969.
60.
Yeah.
And how at that time did it get published in United States magazines?
Oh yeah, somebody translated it, and then it was published really about 4 years after initially being published in the Soviet Union. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure how it attracted the attention of the translator, but
Right.
maybe they were looking for something unusual and they found that.
Right. Well, maybe this was an example of women in the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
So well, I was going to ask you what the American reception of that was, but I'll do some more research on that myself. Thank you so much for talking with us today. There is one question from the audience. Why do you think students' interest in the Russian language, literature, and history has decreased? So, is there a...
Yeah, that's a good question. I said that it had decreased since 1996. Actually, right now we're pretty stable. We have about half as many majors as we did at that time, but it is stable. So it's a good number. We have about 25 Russian majors. I don't know, maybe because, the Cold War is not as much of a thing. Their parents did not, grow up with the Cold War on their brains. Perhaps that's the reason.
Do you think it's also, is there a change in American educational priorities? Like students they want, even when I studied Russian, when everyone could study liberal arts, and
Yes.
everyone asked, what are you going to do with a degree in Russian? But nowadays, kids, I'm sure, are discouraged by their parents to go study Russian literature.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Yes, it's all about like how is this going to make you money, right?
Right.
And so students are thinking about that. Yeah. So we see a lot of double majors in economics and business, or international affairs and Russian. Sorry, business in Russian, economics in Russian,
Hmm.
international affairs in Russian, history in Russian. So, but yes, the humanities are suffering as a whole.
Hmm.
And I think that's because of the reason you said, Michael,
Right.
that people are looking for um, a career, a step
Right.
way to a career. Hmm.
Right. And I'm originally from West Virginia, and I know that West Virginia University, like many others, just completely cut
They
their
did.
Russian program.
They did, which is
Um,
very sad. I'm
It's
not sure.
terrible.
Yeah.
It's terrible. Well, I
Yeah.
don't want to. I hate to end on that sad note.
No,
I'm sorry I brought it up.
we don't expect that to happen here at University
No.
of
It,
Colorado. And I think most universities are not looking at cutting at anything. Yeah.
well,
It's
it sounds
just
like you have a very vibrant program,
we do. Yeah.
and it's been wonderful talking to you, and thank you for sharing your experiences with us. And to all of those watching, please stay tuned for the next speaker in our Culture Connection series. Thank you, Laura. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much, Michael. It's been a pleasure talking to all of you.